Hi, and welcome to another session of the Public Interest Technology Colloquium. Today's colloquium is dedicated to operationalizing data ethics and trustworthiness, forces of change. My name is Katina Michael. I'm a professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and the School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence, and I'm also the director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective. Today, we have with us a special guest, Mathew Mytka from Sydney, Australia, a social entrepreneur and the founder of Greater Than Learning. We're so fortunate to have Matt beaming in at about 3:30 from Australia, and that is 3:30 a.m. Matt has a wonderful platform he'll be sharing with us today, greaterthanlearning.online, and I navigate to the defining impact, where he's really talking about aligning to the public interest and creating positive outcomes for the people that use the tools and technologies in a community context, both new tools and those that have been redesigned. He's very much about the future of work, but how do we design a better future? And that's what he'll be talking to us about today. I've had the pleasure of working with Matt through my PIT 502 Co-Designing the Future course, where he literally did a lot of the instructional design behind the course end to end, and 11 PIT students were the recipients of his wonderful instructional design in that course. And there are a few YouTube clips up already where he's talking about design and his learning from his work. Matt, there's so much more I could say about you, but I know you're going to introduce yourself as well as we go on, but welcome formally, and thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Katina, for the wonderful introduction. Thanks everyone who is in the session already. Welcome. I'll do a short acknowledgement to country, just to start off before I share my screen and get into some of the details. So I acknowledge and we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we work, in which I work here in Gadigal country, which is Sydney in Australia. So acknowledging the Indigenous peoples past and present, as well as acknowledging the Indigenous people whose lives have been disrupted and continue to be disrupted due to the internet infrastructure and all this digital infrastructure that we rely upon for work in our modern society. So I will now share my screen and get into it. About me, I won't spend too much time talking about myself. That I do have a blog, which I'll share a link to. That's kind of my personal blog, where you can probably learn much more about me. I am a diverse creature of learning, and I had a very diverse career. I started out in construction at 14 after I got kicked out of school. I was a little bit of a troublemaker, and I've had lots of different kind of career changes over the past couple of decades. Now, I won't tell my age. I have a little bit of a riddle that maybe people might be able to guess and drop something into the chat. And that riddle is that I'm going on the meaning of life, and I'm past my 13th prime. So if you can figure that one out, let me know, and I've got a special prize for you. So here, what we see is my purpose, my values, and my principles. And the reason when I put this up is because I'm talking about ethics. And ethics is based upon moral philosophy, but it's about a decision-making process where we're working in alignment to our purpose, our values, and our principles. And you'll probably see in some of the work that I've done and some of the things that I'll talk about, where this purpose, my values, and my principles kind of come out in the work that I do. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about maybe some of the intellectual origins of the work that I do. And this is actually an essay that I wrote as part of a module in my university course when I was a mature age student, called Social Theory. And this essay was actually on looking at the systematic collection of data, personal data, people's data, data about people, and the mechanisms in which are used to influence people's perceptions and control their behavior. And this is where my interest started out, and this was well over a decade ago, 2009. And what we see here is just my lecturer and tutor's comments at the end of my essay. This is fine, but we still have to consider, how do we live when power is so invisible and omnipresent like the Christian God? And for those that are maybe familiar with some social theorists, Foucault, a famous French philosopher, he wrote lots of amazing books, very interesting but very dense. And his work was quite influential in my thinking early on, and he wrote a book that called Knowledge and Power, and we will talk a little bit about that in the session today. So that's kind of where it all started to some degree. So what do I do? Kind of work at the intersection of applied ethics, trustworthiness, and digital technologies. So looking at how ethics plays out in the digital technologies that we create, and where trustworthiness is relevant. And I've got some little visuals up here. These are the signals and drivers of trustworthiness. But I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail throughout this session. So Katina asked me to, or prompted me with, well, what are some memorable projects that I've worked on that are relevant to this? So I've worked on lots of different projects, and this was actually a great exercise. It was like, wow, I could talk about so many different things here. What are the ones that are going to be relevant? And so early on in this kind of journey, I worked on a privacy-centric personal data wallet, which was built, the functional prototype was built on BitSync, which is BitTorrent's kind of distributed and decentralized cloud sharing system. That didn't go anywhere. It was a little bit of a side project at the time, and it was very early in that kind of that problem space's maturation. So it didn't really go anywhere, but it definitely was memorable. I learned a lot about networks and peer-to-peer systems and personal data and privacy and things like that during that period. I've worked on big research projects. So this one was called A Day in the Life of Data. And this was looking at the day in the life of the average Australian, which is a bit of a pigeonholing of people, but the average Australian as they're interacting with network connected devices, and what are the types of data collection activities that take place. This was done with the Consumer Policy Research Centre here in Australia. And that was really interesting. I can share some links if people are interested after that, if they want to go into that detail. Some other ones that are a little bit more recent, working with the data standards body here in Australia on a national data sharing framework called the Consumer Data Right. And as part of the work that I'd done with my former business partner, Nathan Kinch, we had a systematic framework and toolkit to design more trustworthy data sharing experiences that became kind of our thing. And the data standards body had got us in to firstly design some foundational ways to go about designing for consent-based data sharing experiences. So we developed a design system. So consistency in the different research streams could be used. So people could use consistent design patterns for that, as well as metrics that were really important to it. And those metrics are here is comprehension, time to comprehension, and the propensity for people to willingly share their data. I then led one of the research streams on consent management and revocation, which is where people be able to manage all the different consents with different parties that they have and go about how do they go about revoking them. So that was a whole bunch of research, about 40 different research participants, and it was a mix of hybrid methodology of outcome-focused usability with simulated contextual inquiry. So that was a really memorable project. It went on to influence all the standards and guidelines for that particular national framework that we have here in Australia. And then another one that's a little bit more relevant to the talk today, and that's on it was a very complex transformation project done with Autodesk, looking at how to operationalize their data ethics principles that they've developed. And a lot of my focus over the past decade has been on more in the trenches. How does this really work? Like if I'm a product manager, how do I go about actually doing this and helping my team to make decisions and more ethical decisions over the way that data is collected and used in the business? So this is actually just my program design initially before I flew out to San Francisco to figure out how we were going to actually run the project. Again, not going to talk about the detail there because there would be a lot to unpack. So what is data ethics? Starting with definitions, I guess, is quite important, so that we make sure that we're talking about something that is defined. And this is a very big definition from, I guess, the godfather of information ethics and data ethics, Luciano Floridi, and this is from the Royal Society. And I'm not going to read this out verbatim, but you can see that it encompasses quite a lot and very different from other forms of ethics, like digital ethics, which is about all the digital technologies that we use in the ethical decision-making process we use, or information ethics. It's the lower level of abstraction about data. So this is the data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid that's used in as a kind of conceptual model in knowledge management. So this talk is going to focus on operationalizing data ethics and some of the forces of change. I'll talk a little bit about those forces and what is influencing progress and what is hindering progress to move organizations towards behaviors that are more about embedded decision-making within their everyday workflows. So I'll just switch over to another one here, and I'll make sure that I'm zooming in so that everyone can see it. So this is going to be high level because there is a lot of detail that I could go into. This is based upon a tool that I built upon, which is called the switching formula. And I developed a canvas to support using this formula. And it's essentially people switch from their current behaviors to new behaviors based upon a range of influencing motivational forces. And the theoretical underpinnings of this particular framework come from everything from migration patterns, push-pull mooring, that influences people to migrate from one country to another, to consumer behavior and consumer psychology. So it's got a lot of theoretical underpinnings, and I'd developed this tool while I was working as a head of product and growth at a cryptocurrency exchange, where there was a lot of people having to switch from how they currently invest their money, where they spend their money, and even where they store their cryptocurrency, where it was looking at how do we get people to control their own keys to their wallets, so that they're in control of their assets. So that's some of, I guess, the background to this tool that I'll use to frame some of this. So firstly, we'll look at what are the existing behaviors that we currently see within organizations, and this is based on all my experience. So it's not just purely Matt's opinion. And then we'll look at some of the new behaviors that are kind of needed, and we'll talk a little bit about these different forces that are influencing the change. So some of the existing forces that are quite prevalent today are these existing behaviors that we see. So data ethics is essentially, it's not really prioritized a lot. It's talked about a lot, but moving from high-level feel-good principles to actually the practices that are necessary tend to be absent. It's seen as an afterthought, so it's reactive rather than proactive. So when something goes wrong, that's when it tends to be, oh crap, we didn't think about this. There was some actual consequence as a result of how data was collected, be that in marketing and not asking for consent, or even in the way that a machine learning model might have been trained on data, and where there might have been bias that is in a model that created downstream impact for the communities in which that technology was deployed. And organizations, individuals within organizations, they're not thinking very deeply about these issues. There's smaller budgets. It's just, so if the money isn't being devoted to it, it's really hard to actually make progress. Budgets are generally allocated, unfortunately, like on a yearly basis a lot of the time, which means that flexibility is not necessarily always there. So that becomes a big problem. There's an ostrich effect in the sense that it becomes quite complicated in a large organization, and because it's quite complicated, people just stick their head in the sand and they don't want to actually deal with it because of that complexity. And you can't always solve for complexity. You need to learn to embrace it, but that becomes quite a challenging prospect. Data socialization, so having data flowing across the organization is a necessary part. So there's poor practices involved with that, and there's also just poor data management and data governance across a lot of businesses. So there's a lot of siloing between different functions in a business. As a result of a lot of this as well, there's kind of erring on the side of caution. So instead of having clarity, they're very cautious a lot of the time, and as a result, that hinders innovation, because people aren't forcing the discussions around, okay, well, we're collecting this data, we're not really sure about why we should be collecting it, or what might happen as a result of us collecting it down the line, these known unknowns. And then those discussions just aren't being had. So there's lots more I could probably go into, but these are some main themes that I've seen quite a lot over the past few years. So what are the new behaviors? If we were to get an organization to be doing this and having this part of their everyday practices and going through a transformation, because it is quite a transformation for organizations to move from principles and values to actual practices. So some of these new behaviors, so engaging wholeheartedly in transformation efforts, that is absolutely essential, and that seems quite vague. What does that mean? Well, that means that everyone that is involved in any initiative needs to really embrace it. They need to be supported through the change process as much as possible. And this one's quite significant, and I think this is one of the linchpin issues. So real psychological safety, people feeling that they can actually talk up and speak about some of these concerns that they might have in how data is being used in digital products and services. And there's much more recognition of this now than there has been in the past, although it's still very hard to bring about. Harnessing existing tools and validating them. So there's a lot of different tools, be that like in data science with command line tools or algorithmic auditing tools, or even tools that provide lenses up front to help people think about how data can be used and what are the consequences, both positive and negative, of some of those uses of data. And I'll talk about some of those tools later on. It needs to be made part of everyday workflows in products, cross-functional teams, in marketing, in operations. So it needs to be embedded in the everyday workflows of people in these businesses. And that takes a lot of time, particularly when you've got a business that's complicated and got, so for instance, Autodesk had over 100 products. They had lots of different complexity in their business. So there was an acknowledgement that this is just going to take a long time to start bringing this into everyday workflows. Engaging stakeholders. This is a really important one. And what do we mean by stakeholders? So stakeholders is everything from, absolutely your customers, the communities in which you operate and the customers in which you serve, but also your employees across the business. It might also even be civil society, privacy advocates, data protection regulators. So there's lots of different stakeholders that can be brought in into the ethical decision-making process and build bodies of evidence that can support ongoing decision-making as well as kind of collective learning. There needs to be much more learning, social learning in particular, in an organization to understand the nuance, because ethics is very contextual. It's related to the values, the purpose of an organization. It's also related to the values of people within the communities in which they serve, and also where law might influence it as well. And I'll talk a little bit about the over-reliance on legal departments to make ethical decisions, which is another challenge as well. Just acknowledging, being humble, that you have a limited understanding of all the complexity of some of these issues that come up, and courageous action at scale. So people need to demonstrate this both at the top and at the bottom across the organizational stack, to be bold and courageous and compassionate in how they're approaching this, because it's it's a learning process that they have to go through. So there's some of the new behaviors. So what's pushing organizations at the moment? So pushing in the sense that these are the things that they want to move away from, as well as the things that are in their environment, their market environment, that are influencing them. So we have a lot of legislative forces that are influencing it, be that privacy legislation and data protection legislation, as well as national data sharing frameworks. I think in the US, one of the executive orders from Biden is about giving people more control, and it was even part of Andrew Yang, his kind of election campaign, for instance, where he was talking about personal data sovereignty and giving people the ability to monetize their data, which is probably not the right approach, but I'm not going to dive into that one. The technology is moving fast, and there's more ethical alternatives now available. So it's becoming a little bit easier for organizations to start moving in this direction, and that's something that pushes them. Organizations are looking to de-silo their data. They're looking to go, yeah, we want to be able to have data flowing between different functions within the business. There's a desire for more contextual understanding of customers. So this idea that we want a 360-degree view of our customers is something that is pushing them, and customers are kind of demanding that they have a little bit more control, which is also something that I'll talk about it as a pull, something pulling organizations as well. The lack of clarity that people within organizations have. So these high-level principles, it's like, oh, we want to work on net benefit as a principle and ensure that the maximum amount of benefit is created for the maximum number of people within our kind of the communities in which we serve. That's a very utilitarian principle, but that might be a principle, but that principle is not enough. And that recognition is a push towards these new behaviors. Younger hires in markets. So this is a really interesting one where people coming up as professionals looking to get hired by technology firms or bigger firms, they're considerate of these things. So they're actually demanding that these organizations kind of have a stance at the very least on things related to the ethical use of data, as well as current team members. They're kind of pushing for that as well. I think we've seen a lot of this in the technology sector, particularly in the US, with be that Google or Salesforce or even Facebook, which is probably not the best example of a company that uses data ethically, but employees are kind of demanding this. So that's kind of pushing organizations a lot to transform. And team members they want to learn more about it. Customers wanting more personalization, that essentially means that organizations need to have more trustworthy data practices. So how they're going about collecting and using data needs to be designed better. All right, so the pull forces, and these are the things that are attracting organizations. It's like, oh yeah, these are the outcomes that we're really excited about. So they're motivating organizations. Ethical data practices, it's a competitive advantage, and that's being seen as a point of differentiation. Oh, we can use this to differentiate our brand. Now that might not be the right motivation. That's arguable, but again, it's something that is attracting organizations towards these new ways of working. Those new ways of working, they're just going to be transformative, and there is a recognition of that. That's going to help people, teams, the whole of organization to transform and actually be more innovative as well. The strategic intent is there. You're getting these authorizing environments where the board and the executive committees will say, yeah, we need to have a position on this, and they'll talk about the ethical principles. So that's actually becoming an attractive position for boards to be having at that senior leadership and management level. Customers are looking for one place, and this is partly influenced as well by legislation like GDPR, or in the US, California with the CCPA. Customers having this single place where they can control consents and access and permissions. So this is forcing a lot of transformation to take place. So this is the progress making forces. Now I'll just kind of talk about some of the things that are hindering progress. And these are the things that are kind of keeping people where they are and restricting them. So there's a recognition that there's a fear that this has to get done right. And if it doesn't get done right, that something's going to go wrong and they're going to lose brand equity. So that's something that's quite scary. And there's some language here that might be offensive, so I do apologize, but this is almost like verbatim some of the things that I have heard. You need to really get this right. Again, if we're transparent about our data practices, this might damage trust. So this is a fear that actually is quite common, is if we tell people about how we're using their data, that they're not going to say yes to us having access to it. And I think this is happening much more now with the transforming of cookies as a tracking technology, for instance, where companies are being forced to say, yeah, here's how we're sharing your data. Here's all the parties that we're sharing it with, and even designing that in a way that improves the ability for people to make an informed decision is actually quite scary. So organizations are still using deception patterns and things like that in their designs because they're afraid that people are just going to say no. There's just a lot of doubt and skepticism that the challenges can be overcome, and that's understandable. It is quite complicated. There's fears that even having a position not matching the practices is going to create problems for the brand. So if we do this and we don't do what we say, we're in trouble. We're better off not saying anything at all. Ethics can be seen as a hindrance in and of itself. It's just like it becomes seen as like a bureaucratic decision-making process, and it doesn't need to be, but that's how it sometimes is seen. It's like it's just going to get in the way. They're not having hard conversations. They're afraid to talk about the trade-offs that get made between maximizing shareholder value and being customer-centric, which is this tension in a lot of businesses where, as a publicly listed company, for instance, the directors are legally obligated. They have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize shareholder value and dividends in the work that they do, and that sometimes comes into conflict with being, focusing on the customer and giving customers agency, particularly of the data. This is definitely a big one, where we're struggling to do real customer discovery and engage our customers in the process of product design, and doing it with customers, not just for them, becomes like this. It's such a big change in the mindset, in the skill sets and toolkits and ways of working. So that's a big hindrance. All right. So that's some of the anxieties. Now, what's some of the behaviors that are just where people are just like, we're going to stay where we are. These are allegiance to the current behaviors. There's no unethical behavior here, and these are kind of captured as like statements that are the sentiment of all the different things that I've heard in my experience. We already have an ethics code or an ethical code of conduct that's sufficient for us to be ethical. No, it's not, but that's the position that gets taken a lot of the time. The old guard, so older people in, and this is not a, hey boomer, you're wrong type perspective, but people that are very set in their ways, they just want to continue doing the things the way that they are. They're not willing to change, and they're kind of quite comfortable just plodding along, and particularly if they have quite a valuable business model and there's no real major incentives for them to change. It's just another thing. There's a lot of change fatigue in organizations. They've gone through digital transformations where they're having to digitize a lot of their services, their workflows internally. And we'll do it when it's a must-have, and it's not necessarily seen as a must-have quite yet. People are just happy to work within their silos and not have to deal with all the complexity of inter-organization and intersectional collaboration between their different departments. So they'll just continue doing things the way that they've always been done. Leadership is if leadership is too top down and there's an authoritarian style of leadership, it's really hard to do this. You kind of have to start moving to much more flatter circle style rather than triangles in the hierarchies in organizations. So people need to be a little bit more autonomous and flexible, but that leadership style is not as prevalent as it needs to be. Again, the change fatigue. So scaled, agile, for enterprise, SAFE, acronym. They're going through those types of changes, and that's not bedded down yet. So how can we do this other thing? No, let's just stay where we are. So these are some of the broader forces of change that are both making progress towards these new behaviors, as well as hindering progress and keeping organizations, individuals, teams where they are. And this is both prevalent in the public and the private sectors. This is not just isolated to commercial focused businesses. You probably see this a lot in the public sector as well. So a little bit of coming and empathizing with I'll just change this one. Empathizing with the individuals, and this is based upon lots of the research that I've done, and again synthesizing these different statements. They're general oversimplifications, but for the purposes of this, this is something that we might see. So what do people say? Who or where do I go to get answers for these? Oh, there's a challenge. Like who, where, and that's extremely common. They're looking for that clarity, and they can't do it alone. You can't independently make these types of decisions in an organization. And what do they think when they go about doing this? Effort. No one has clarity. And what do they do? So what do they hear? You should ask legal about this. And this is a very prominent theme where there's an over-reliance on legal departments, and lawyers. Yes, they're practicing jurisprudence, and they went through and have some grounding in moral philosophy, but they're not the oracles that you should be always turning to. And unfortunately, they are a lot in organizations. Now, what is legal is not always what is ethical. So you should ask legal about this is a common thing that people hear. People just feel frustrated. They feel alone and they feel isolated. And that becomes quite detrimental to people's well-being as individuals within organizations. And what do? They just avoid. They avoid having the hard conversations that are necessary to start surfacing these things and discussing how, we're not asking for consent here. It's not informed consent. They just won't. They'll avoid it because there's no clarity, there's no support. And a lot of the times there's a lack of psychological safety for people to even speak up about that. So empathizing with the people within organizations, the humans that are in these decision-making contexts is really important. So how do we go about alleviating that? And I'll talk about this just quickly using, this is like an operating system that can help to operationalize data ethics and even just ethics in general in a business. And it was designed to interface with agile workflows and modern product development workflows quite a lot. So what we have, I'll just kind of, before I go into the complexity of this diagram, and I probably won't be able to go into all of it, but I'll just talk about some of the functions and what's the objective of this. So this is a consistent set of operational processes to support individuals, teams in deciding, documenting, and verifying that their data processing activities that they're undertaking are socially preferable. And I'll define what I mean by that in a moment. Socially preferable in intent and outcome, bringing about empirical evidence to support the best choice, best possible choice. Now, it's not the right choice, it's the best possible choice in a highly collaborative, coordinated, and participatory manner. So there's key functions. There's a backlog of ethics issues where ethical issues around collection, use of data can be surfaced. And that's really important that there's a place where they can live, they can be groomed, they can be understood, they can be discussed, they can be surfaced and prioritized. There's a decision log, and this is a central place, and I'll give some examples of this. There's a central place where decisions, where trade-offs get made, are surfaced. And this, I push for radical transparency as much as possible in this, but that again is actually, as we talked about in some of the forces, it's very scary. It's a scary prospect for a lot of organizations to start being transparent about the trade-offs that they're making, because they can damage their reputation. They can lose money. Their stock price can go down if these things come out, but eventually they'll come out anyway. So you're better off trying to move towards it now rather than later. So running experiments for social preferability. So there's a way to go about testing for being having the most socially preferable practices. A knowledge base, having a place where people can learn, and all this knowledge, be that about your frameworks, your purpose, your values, your principles, tools that you can use, that there's a place that people can go to find those things and learn together. And at the start, you kind of need, in an organization, you need a dedicated team at the start to nurture and model the behaviors at the start when you're really starting to get into the operationalizing of this. And this should be cross-functional. It should be across people from marketing, operations, legal, design, engineering, that are working together. Now, this might not. We are seeing more positions in market now, like chief trust and safety officer titles, things like that, chief ethical and humane use officer. So they're at the top, but they're actually not. That idea that if you just put a person at the top, that things are going to change is actually not the best approach. So these functions, we can see it kind of playing out here. Issues can be submitted and go into a backlog. There's a knowledge base where things get learned. And I'll just quickly talk through a scenario, and then I'll jump into like some examples of how we've gone about applying this approach in the social learning platform that I've built. So let's say there's a scenario. I'm a financial services company, and we're wanting to collect transactional data and use it in a way that we haven't done before. So I would go to the knowledge base. I would find a tool. Let's say it's a tool called consequence scanning, and consequence scanning is a way to scan your environment. It's a upfront proactive approach to look at all the different consequences, both negative and positive, that might be influenced from using this transactional data in this new way. They run a workshop internally. They might ideally bring in customers into that process. That would be the ideal. And they come out of that, and they're either going to get clarity on how to move forward, or they're not. And more often than not, they're unlikely to get clarity to be able to make a decision. So if they do, they just log that decision. That decision gets put into the decision log. And I'll talk about that and how you can be transparent with that in a moment. If they don't, they assess it against their principles further. They're either going to get clarity or not. If they do, again, the decision gets logged. If they don't, there's an issue that gets submitted to the backlog where the team that is responsible for leading this can actually do a more thorough assessment. When that gets groomed, it moves to decisions, consistent decisions as part of that core team. Now you can have committees, and there's a lot of discussion around having committees with this. We've got our ethics committee. There's a lot of challenges with that when you have committees that are brought in, how they're incentivized. And we saw this a lot even with data protection officers, with GDPR as a requirement, having a person responsible. They're sometimes scared of even raising these issues, because if their job is on the line, they're probably not going to force the discussion. So some level of autonomy and independence is really crucial for these things to work well. So the social preferability experiments, and I'm just going to jump down a little bit to here. So what do we mean by social preferability? So if you think about this simply on a scale, we have what is socially unacceptable. So these are the things that are like, no, we should not be using this transactional data in this way. This is going to, in this training, this new model, this is going to lead to loans being denied for people that are already underprivileged, and amplifying existing social disadvantage. So no, we're not going to do this. So it's socially unacceptable. It's acceptable. So this is kind of where a lot of organizations will sit. This is what we can get away with a lot of the time, which is unfortunately the reality. And socially preferable, this is the upper bounds. This is almost like, this is the ideal outcome. This is our ideal intent. Now, you might think of this as idealistic or utopic, but absolutely it is. You should be aiming for that. Doesn't mean that you're going to get there. I mean, utopia essentially means no place. So it's impossible, but you should be aiming for it regardless. So when you're testing for social preferability, there's lots of different ways to go about doing this, but there's lots of simple ways to do it as well that I probably don't have time to jump into methodologies and things like that. But what we're aiming for is the most socially preferable options. So if you run experiments, what we're trying to do is, so we define those experiments. You're bringing in a lot of cross-functional people into this. And ideally, you bring in external stakeholders, you bring in customers, you bring in regulators. So looking at these different drivers of trustworthiness, there's inclusion there. You're trying to include your communities that might be impacted by this decision. You're trying to act with integrity, fairness, and respect. So you run those experiments that can be done, light touch, clickable prototypes, basic A/B testing on prototypes with different cohorts. Level of rigor will vary based on resources and maturity of the organization, but these things can be done reasonably simply. When you get results, you've tested your hypotheses, you log the decisions, you update your knowledge base, and people can learn. You're never going to get it right. And this is one of the challenges that we're trying to always get it right. And there's no right. There's just better. So what I'll do is I'll just talk a little bit about how we've used this in the learning platform. And the learning platforms, this is a social learning platform, and I'll just jump over to this for a moment. We have these forces that are influencing. This is a pretty wicked problem that I've been interested in trying to solve in some way. And what we see is there's an intent to action gap. We call this the ethical intent to action gap. So there's ethical intent a lot of the time. There's stated intent, but the action, the follow through is missing. And inside this gap varies a lot, but for the most part, it's pretty gaping in large organizations. This is some research that was done by at MIT, the Sloan School of Management, and an organization called Culture X, where they were looking at the stated values of companies. And this is kind of Fortune 500 companies, so it was very isolated to the US, but there was essentially no correlation between the stated values and actually what the employees internally in the organization said the companies actually did. So this is an indication that there's a big gap between what they say, what organizations say they will do, and what they actually do. And this is a problem. This creates problems for those organizations. It creates problems for the communities in which they serve. It creates problems for society. So at the moment, it is absolutely too hard to do this well. And I'll talk a little bit about this BJ Fogg's model before I wrap up, because I know I'm about to run over time. So the learning platform is essentially designed to kind of close this ethical intention to action gap. How do we go about doing this? How do we help people learn? How do we help them start tiny and have those tiny steps compound over time to catalyze change? So it's a very big picture. There's social learning, different pedagogies that we can use to support those learning processes. There's ways to connect different communities of practice that are already doing this, practitioners that are really interested, so that they can help others learn. They can learn with their peers, so that everyone can learn faster and better together. So what I'll do is I'll just I'll look at something like disclosure. So we've got a kind of toolkit to help design disclosures, legal disclosures like privacy policies, privacy notices, data protection notices, terms and conditions, in ways that are much more easier to engage with. And I won't go through all the detail here, but this is what we call the relationship agreement, which is like a terms and conditions that's designed in a way that is focused on the roles and responsibilities, the things that we can do, that we can't do, the things that individuals as members of the community and that sign up for the platform, the things that they can do and can't do as well. So we've applied this, and this is it's not the best we could do, it's the best we could do given our current constraints. And that's always important to recognize, that just try to get better every little step, and that's all you can hope for. Then on the decision, this is the decision log, and this is a publicly available decision log, and I'll just kind of look at this in our footer IA. So you can come here and you can look at the decisions that we've made, and how we've gone about making those decisions. And I won't go into a lot of the detail here, but people can go in and check it out. And this is using a tool called Confluence. Some people might be familiar. Atlassian. Atlassian's tools are used by a large portion of the biggest companies in the world. So there's probably some easy ways for them to get started on this. So look at the key decision log here. It's using existing templates as well within their system. So, as you can see, and I'll talk about some lessons learned. So our MVP stack, like the trade-offs that we made on our architecture, how we're going to try and innovate, where we're trade-off, like the information is here for people to see. Now, not everyone's going to want to engage with this level of detail, but we're being transparent. We're trying to be open, and the decisions that get made can be publicly published so that there's a record of it. You can even actually go in here and see the edit history and things like that. So that level of transparency is what you should aim for, but there's going to be various appetites for organizations. So how do we get started if we're a smaller organization doing this? And I'll just kind of talk about this with the behavioral model, which is developed by BJ Fogg in his work at the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab, starting out in the 90s, which is now, I think, called the Behavioral Design Lab, which is still part of Stanford. And this is a simple model to understand behavior, where behavior equals motivation, ability, and a prompt at the same time. So when behavior happens, when sufficient motivation, sufficient ability, and an effective prompt are all there at the same time in that context. So motivation fluctuates a lot. We shouldn't rely upon people's motivation being consistent, because there's a lot of fluctuation. People are motivated by lots of different things: belonging, pleasure, pain. There's kind of different influences for motivation. And then there's ability. And ability is a function of lots of different things: my time, my skills, my resources. What do I have available to be able to engage in this behavior? It might not be the right time. I might not have the energy to do this rigorous privacy impact assessment right now. So sometimes it becomes too difficult. So what we're aiming for is we're trying to, and there's different types of prompts, and I'm not going to explain all this, but we're trying to make it as easy as possible for people to get started. So you don't have to rely upon high motivation. People can do things when they're not very motivated. And we get started here. And then you progressively move your way up to be able to rely upon things that are much harder to do. So as you can see, there's a bit of a trade-off between ability and motivation. If we're prompting people when they're really motivated and something's just really hard to do, they're just going to get frustrated because they still can't do it. Down here, when people are not very motivated at all, and it's still quite easy to do, and you're prompting them, they're going to get very annoyed. So there's different parts to this. Now, why does this matter here? So if we're talking about getting started, I'll just talk about an ethical techniques and tools directory that we created, which is a publicly available set of kind of directory of tools. So you can get started with very simple things, and I'll just kind of ethical litmus tests. And this is just a great resource that just gives you a set of prompting questions. And I'll just give you an example here. Now, anyone can do this. This is like asking these simple questions. Do I benefit disproportionately from this collection of data? Like just asking that question. This helps you to think proactively about how you're using data. Jump forward 50 years, did this age well? Is this a zero-sum game? So is there always going to be a winner, or can we have something positive sum? So these prompting questions are easy ways to start thinking about it up front. And this is a start. You're not going to get things right, but at least you're going to start bringing this into your practices early on in your process, and even retrospectively reviewing existing products and services that you use. So that's a little bit about the platform. We've incorporated this into the whole of our platform. We've got courses, short courses for people to kind of get started on some of these things that are all currently freely available. So the idea that people need to have structured learning, but also the social learning where they're learning with their peers, they're learning through conversation, they're learning through mirroring and modeling behavior. And that's a incremental set of step changes that can take place. And our kind of community of practice is currently going through that themselves as practitioners. So that's a little bit about the platform. I'll stop now. Hopefully there was enough that prompted a whole bunch of questions. And if someone's got an answer to my riddle that I put at the start, please let me know.